Those of you that weren't able to join us yesterday, we had such an inspiring day yesterday of presentations and all sorts of different topics that really did help us to reconnect with some of the purposes and opportunities of Participedia. My name is Susanna Haas Lyons, and I have the privilege of being the lead facilitator for today's event. And I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Matsqui nations here in British Columbia. And I invite you to take a minute to reflect on the lands and the people of the lands where you are today. Say those names to yourself. You can put them into the chat. Offer your attention to relationship with, if you have Indigenous neighbors, if you are of an Indigenous community, relationship to land, opportunities for reconciliation, where meaningful. For all of us, a chance to strengthen and decolonize our practices. So we started looking at our purpose. Where have we come from? What kinds of impacts have we had? What do we mean when we talk about democratic innovations? Then yesterday we did an exchange of research and got inspired and energized. And that was yesterday. And then today we're going to be looking at our research priorities, hearing from each of the research cluster leads, and knowing that this is, really based on the grant application, and there's much to be defined in collaboration with the various teams and thinking about how we're going to move forward together. So we'll hear, after we do some welcomes to each other, we'll hear from Bonny. And then what we're going to do is we're going to hear 2 presentations. So yesterday we heard 3 and then a breakout. Today it'll be 2 presentations and then a breakout. And so we'll hear first about participatory governance and democracy and digital communication. Those are 2 of the research clusters. And I know not everyone is familiar with them, and we don't expect you to be. That's totally fine. Just take what you can from what you hear. Then we'll go into a breakout discussion, and we'll have a conversation talking about what are the opportunities that you see there. And I'll show you the discussion questions in a bit. We'll break. And then we'll do again another 2 presentations, hearing about human and political rights, democracy across borders, a breakout discussion, and then the last set of 2 presentations, hearing about the research cluster of democratic accountability and democratic representation. And then we'll have a chance to close for now, but we'll be meeting again. At this time, it is my pleasure to pass it over to Bonny Ibhawoh, our lead for Participedia and from McMaster University.
Thank you so much, Susanna, for helping us, move along this past few days, and welcome everyone again. Thank you for staying with us. Those of us who've joined intermittently, thank you too. And thank you in particular to the presenters yesterday. You guys were awesome and have inspired me to practice my Pecha Kucha presentation for later today. So what I'm going to do today is just to share some of the ideas behind Participedia. I understand that not everyone is familiar with Participedia, so what I aim to do is to just get a sense of what we are. So Participedia is first and foremost a network of researchers, educators, practitioners, policymakers, and activists who are interested in questions of public participation, civic inclusion, and democratic innovation. There is a core research team that's been funded for the past few years. We heard on the first day that this initiative really came from the work of Archon and Mark Warren. They got the first grant based at UBC. So we're very grateful for their pioneering work that we're now trying to continue with Participedia Phase 2. So for Participedia Phase 1, we got a $2.5 million grant, Mark did, which ran for 5 years. And what we've just received from the Canadian, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, it's a renewal of that $2.5 million grant, now based out of McMaster University. And it is very rare for the Canadian Granting Agency to renew a grant. This is typically not done. And the fact that they've renewed Participedia's grant is in many ways a testament to the great work that all the members of Phase 1 did, those who initiated this. And my hope is that we can continue in that tradition with phase 2. So we are essentially a global network, but we are also a platform. Next slide, please. So the way many people come to Participedia is through the platform. This is what people see. And so that it's always important to say that the researchers, the people come before the platform. It's the people that make the platform possible. And for Participedia phase 1, we've worked to have over 1,800 cases, 330 methods, 760 organizations from countries around the world, and these figures grow every day. So Participedia is really expanding, and we heard from Jesse on the first day about all the hard work that goes on behind the scene to make the Participedia platform functional, accessible, and we plan to continue with that work. Next slide, please. So how is Participedia organized? And here I'm going to speak to the organization of Participedia phase 2. So Participedia phase 2, it's organized around what we call a tripartite, coordinated, decentralized model of research. So what we plan to do is to have clusters focused on 6 new areas, which are outlined here. But one of the challenges of the cluster model to research organization is that clusters can sometimes become siloed in their work, and that can lead to disconnections between the research team. So we have the 3 research teams that are essentially going to help us bring coherence and coordination to the project. And ultimately, the project will be led by an executive committee, which comprises all the team leads and all the cluster chairs. Next slide. So what did phase 1 do? So Participedia phase 1 developed a web-based platform, participedia.net, which we all know. Over 100 publication reports and presentations that draw on Participedia. Extensive student training resources, including the summer schools that were organized, I think, at the University of Montreal. We plan to continue with those. Dataverse repository at Harvard, and we're expanding on that with also a repository here at McMaster University. Participant and expert observer surveys that went into how we framed Participedia phase 2. The next, please. So what are the phase 2 goals? In a nutshell, we want to build on some of the achievements of phase 1, but also expand those. We want to produce theoretically informed data about democratic innovations, building into the new 6 cluster areas, provide contextual and ethnographic analysis. And these comes directly from user surveys. People who've been using Participedia have asked for more in-depth, studies of these cases, in a way that they can use either for policy or for teaching in the classroom. And so we plan to expand some of these case studies through ethnographic and contextual analysis, redesigning and expanding the platform itself to address these 6 new areas, increase method and case and method collections. We are aiming for at least 3,000 of these case and method entries by the end of this next phase of the grant. I'm hoping we can do a lot more than that. Expand capacities of Participedia to the global south. So this is again a response to user surveys that so many of the cases already on Participedia are skewed towards the global north, and we are hoping that we can balance that out by bringing in more cases from the global south. And then finally also address the new knowledge mobilization capacities that we built into the grant, such as developing a podcast, a policy brief, and a global classroom. So it's a very ambitious phase 2 project, but I'm confident that with the enthusiasm that I have seen in the past 2 days and the caliber of partners and researchers that we have, we will achieve these goals. Okay, so this is just in a nutshell what the team and clusters look like. So this is what went into the grant. So this is the core research team for Participedia, and we have later today you'll be hearing from the cluster chairs making a presentation about their vision for the work that the clusters will be doing. We're also thankful to the research team leads. And then some of these people were part of the original Participedia project, and they bring continuity to the project. We've also brought in some new leaders who would refresh the project. And so we're really excited by the quality of team leaders that we have put together on this project. Next. And this is a brief outline, a table of the cluster teams and research teams and cluster composition. So this is again what went into the grant. This is not cast in stone. There's going to be a lot of fluidity and flexibility with this. So I imagine as the project proceeds, people might move to different clusters. We might have new people join the various clusters, but this is what we have for now. Next. So how do clusters do their work? Now, some of us might be familiar with the cluster model of a research organization. Others might not. And frankly, there are different models. So there's no one, standard model. So essentially, the principle behind the cluster model of research organization is participation, and I think this model suits what we do very well. We're pretty much practicing what we preach. We are invested in democratic participation and civic inclusion, and we want our research team to reflect those values that animate our work as researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. So cluster work within the clusters can take either of two forms. It could be projects initiated by two or more members that will count as collaborative research, but it could also be new or ongoing individual projects by members related to the cluster's research agenda. I call this the lone wolf scenario. As academics and practitioners, sometimes we want to do our own thing. That is allowed within the clusters, but we have stated, because Participedia is essentially a partnership, we have stated in our budget principles that we are going to prioritize collaborative projects over individual projects in disbursing funds for this project. And next. So what are the cluster tasks? And I know this will differ from cluster to cluster. Each cluster, as they begin to have their meetings and deliberate on how they want to go about their work, this is going to change. But this is what we said to the funders when we proposed this project, that we will be scoping these cluster areas, providing a broad view of what democratic innovation might mean under each cluster topic, provide theoretical definition and refinement. And we've already started that with the discussion about the contextual meanings of democratic innovations that started this conference in day one. So some of that's already happening. Monitoring crowdsourced data for bias and quality. So here, Participedia faces a kind of interesting dilemma. On the one hand, we want to monitor crowdsourced data for bias and quality, but on the other hand, we don't want to vet these data in such a way that it leads to concerns about, epistemological hierarchies, knowledge hierarchies, and control. So the beauty of Participedia is that it is crowdsourced, it is knowledge from the ground up, but yet we see the need for some quality control. So it's going to be a balance that we'll have to strike, a delicate balance as we move forward with this project. And next slide. We will be building representative case sets in all the clusters, selecting exemplary cases to build out, developing context-specific survey tools, successes and failures, and delivering other outputs that are outlined on knowledge mobilization or knowledge communication. Knowledge mobilization is just the preferred term for the granting agency. It's really about how do we now communicate our knowledge to academic audiences and the general public. Next. So this is an example of what we've been thinking about for the Human and Political Rights Cluster, which I will be co-chairing with Dr. Rhoda Howard-Haas. So we'll be scoping human rights cases, theorizing human rights as vectors of democratic participation, developing tools to determine the positive or negative effect of human rights. And that, I imagine, is going to be a big theoretical debate. What, in fact, constitutes a positive human rights effect as opposed to a negative human rights effect. Develop methods of identifying and accounting for biases in crowdsourced data. And there are really interesting possibilities here. You know, artificial intelligence, for instance, I'll be talking with the design team to see if there's a way to flag. I do not envisage we'll be calling for removing any entries because of bias, but is there a way we can flag entries for bias? Something like what Twitter is already doing with tweets, you know, this tweet is disputed or this tweet needs to be confirmed or something. So there are many models that we have to think about in how we address this. Ethnographic research at local sites to build out cases, and of course, contributing to the overall project knowledge mobilization agenda with policy briefs, a summer school, podcasts, and surveys. Next, please. So what are the deliverables? So it's really important for us as a project that we fulfill the commitments that we've made to our funders. The funding commitment is a big one, and it's a privilege to be entrusted with all these resources for the kind of research we want to do. And so it's really important for us that we come up with a workable, practical plan to make this happen. So for 2001, what we've said to our funders is that we'll host 5 virtual workshops to theorize and redesign the Participedia platform. And I imagine some of this theorization and workshop will happen within the clusters. We might have all partner workshops. We'll have 4 exchange summits, again, focused on refining the project and dealing with some of the practical issues relating to how we go about the project. And next year, we will complete the expansion of Participedia into the 5 new cluster areas. We're hoping we'll build that into the platform. And this is going to be a co-design, a cooperation and collaboration with the design team on how we do that and do that well. Expanding Participedia online courses, creating some working papers. At Participedia Summer School, we already have interest in by members of the team to organize these at the institutions and opening up, starting up a podcast series. So I imagine some of these conversations will be happening at the cluster levels as we progress. Next slide, please. So for years 3 to 5, the project deliverables kind of expand, and I'm not going to run through all of them here, but essentially it is building on what we have done in years 1 and 2, you know, developing user interfaces, creating policy briefs. And we're hoping that by year 4 and 5, we'll begin to see more tangible, traditional academic outputs, you know, a journal article, a special edition of a journal, a book volume. But these are not going to be the core deliverables of Participedia. We're also going to be interested in communicating knowledge, not just to academics, but also to policymakers in our policy briefs and to students with our summer schools and global classrooms initiative. Next, please. So here are the budget principles, and these relate essentially to the core team that were part of the grant application to the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council. And the budget principles, like I said before, will be many of these partner institutions, universities and think tanks that are part of this grant have made their own commitments to supporting the project. And much of the funding we've received from the Canadian Granting Agency is dedicated to students' research assistants. I think about 80% of the funding is going to students. Because these students will essentially be those working on the cases and also learning from this process. The Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council has student training as part of its core mandate. So that's just the way they're set up. So we will distribute funds, transfer funds to 22 co-applicants and their partner organizations for hiring student RAs to work within the clusters. In year 1, each of the cluster chairs will receive funds to support the cluster research agenda. So we imagine that these funds will go into organizing preliminary cluster conferences and workshops to refine the ideas and the work of the clusters. Now, in years 3 and 5, the funding model is going to be based on need. So we're going to be making decisions about fund distribution based on what the clusters tell us they want to do. And this is a core part of the participatory cluster research model. So the executive committee, which is made up of all the cluster chairs, will be coming together to see where the promising and innovative work is going on. And based on these collective assessment, we will agree on where to allocate the funds in years 3 and 5. And then finally, last slide, please. How can I participate in Participedia? For the time being, membership of the core research team that is funded by the Canadian by the Canadian Research Council is closed. So we have a core team that's been funded, and we've made plans and arrangements on budget allocations for that. However, we do welcome members who want to be part of the network. You can be part of our mailing list. And we are hoping that in years 2 and 3, once we get going, there might be an opportunity to bring new people into the clusters as core research team members. But that will be a decision that clusters will have to make. So the way you can support if you're not part of the core research team at this point is to help write cases and method entries, add your name to our network list, attend our larger partnership conferences. And apart from partners and co-investigators, we also have collaborators who are part of the core research team. And we will be supporting those in terms of providing support to attend our meetings and other ways that we can talk through in the cluster. So I'll stop there. I see I'm already going over time, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities to talk about this. Thank you.
So we're now going to begin. We're going to start with participatory governance, and Nick Vlahos is our speaker from the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, the University of Canberra in Australia. Nick, are you ready?
Yeah, good to go.
Great, over to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm really delighted to present on behalf of the members of Participatory and Deliberative Governance Cluster. Very inspired by a lot of the presentations and a lot of the scholars and practitioners I deeply admire. So just getting started here, my goal is to really situate our cluster's work within a broader context of problems with democracy, present some of the recent work undertaken by our cluster members, give a little bit of a preliminary list of tasks. And this is really just a conversation starter. The idea here is that we look forward to iterating on collective ideas and establishing synergies with our other projects. So just to start, we know the bad news. A lot of us are familiar with the democratic recession that we're so-called experiencing, rise of authoritarianism. We know that John Gaventa has been talking about some of the suppression of certain civic spaces. And we know that there's a lot of apathy, just like our squirrel friend over here, which connects to and converges with distrust of elites. But of course, there's good news, which the deliberative wave has been something that's noted with certain types of clusters of participation, like recommendations on policy questions, evaluation of ballot measures, permanent deliberative models, and the like. And so when we want to start to think about solutions, they come in different formats. Some are citizen initiated, some are municipality initiated, some are well-known and some are others. This picture here is about a local people's economy, which is a community government land trust that provides affordable housing units. And these are the types of things that we can start to highlight as well. And so other solutions go beyond the global and they're, local, and they go more globally. And so here we have, a picture of holding an Emmy. And what we're doing here at the Center for Deliberative Democracy is working with the documentary film team to disseminate and scale up the positive effects of the Global Assembly on Genome Editing. And so what we do know about these innovations is that, they're mobilizers of creative output. We know that citizens like them when they participated in them. Dissatisfied Democrats love them, but politicians, and elected officials are a bit more ambivalent about them. What we don't know is the ripple effect. How are these democratic innovations connecting across entire democratic systems? What are the non-participants viewing them, and what do we need to do to make them see them as legitimate? What about what counts as success, and political context? So in thinking about the remaining part of this brief presentation, here's a couple items on our to-do list. It's not definitive. This is just really a conversation starter. And so we're going to start with mapping and matching. And so, as we know, a lot of us were participating in the grant application, and it started thinking about mapping and matching. So we're going to continue to develop systematic understandings of the problems democracies face, and the solutions that they require. One pressing problem that we're hearing from our cluster members is the problem of political polarization, especially in established democracies, but abroad as well, and we can explore this. Continuing from this, I think one of the ways that we can work on this is to think about problem-based thinking, just like Mark Warren has been thought about in terms of design, like Savard has thought about, and experimenting with different forms of whether it's aggregative, participatory, or deliberative models in response to various problems. And so as an example, we have, from a very own member, Thami here at the Latino Project, which you heard from earlier, collect civil society responses to the pandemic in 18 countries, 2,700 institutional designs on the effectiveness and of democratic quality that's happening. A second item that we have is comparison. And so how about looking at similar innovations or the same ones in different contexts? And here we have Lawrence Vera on our team talking about participatory infrastructures. So what are particular policy areas? How can we solve problems? What hinders and supports democratic innovations? One example, which is recent from members like Andre Bachtiger, EU Economy. This is a project that seeks to compare mini publics in Europe with a focus on policy and public impact. And it's a quantitative coding scheme that can be applied to existing and new Participedia cases. Another example is something that I've been working on with center members, is building upon Michael Neblow's directly representative democracy model. And here we're aiming, to ostensibly compare key insights between regime models, parliamentary and presidential, and how potentially Participedia might offer further comparisons of lessons. Finally, the last to-do list item is evaluation. And so obviously with the quantity or the increase is what's happening with quality. So what types of evaluation frameworks are used? How do sponsors influence the quality? Are citizen-led initiatives more democratic than government-led ones? So one example we have here, something that our center is working on, deliberative democracy, is the concept of deliberative integrity. And it's a counterpart to electoral integrity. Here, we're going to draw on mini publics to try and establish ethical standards that are upheld and assessed. And so this project can directly align with phase 2 in supporting Participedia's existing efforts on evaluation. Now, in terms of scientific evaluation, there are very many different methods to evaluate participatory and deliberative practices. So one such effort is a forthcoming edited volume by Participedia members, which assesses 30 different methods of how to study and research deliberative practices. So ultimately, in conclusion, I just want to say that obviously governance in this form is more than structured. It's what we require is a healthy civil society. And we need to look at the sorts of intersections between formal, informal, micro, macro, outline tensions, and seek sustainable ways to attenuate problems. And as that plane suggests, I really hope to meet and connect everyone in person. And lastly, there's a lot of great resources that are currently out there that we aim to build upon, and we can draw from. Excellent work that's coming out, and we look forward to producing new work and collaborating. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Wow, very inspiring. And as I put in the comments, I'm really looking forward to seeing this work coming out on assessing deliberative practices. That would be a great use to myself as a practitioner. So thank you. Our next presenter is Edana Beauvais from the Department of Political Science at Simon Fraser University in Canada. Edana, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be working with this fabulous team, as always. And I'm thrilled to be leading the Democracy and Digital Communications Research Cluster. So we can go to the next slide. The link between technological change and changes in communications is nothing new. Thanks to technological advances in the 15th century, print became the first medium of mass communication. Today, the revolution is digital. So the ability to store and share information is dramatically changing how we communicate with one another. Unfortunately, the ability for anyone to spread information online raises concerns about the danger of misinformation. On the other hand, the democratization of mass communication also empowers those who might otherwise go unheard. Finally, there's hope that new technologies can empower deliberative speech online. As we know, social media and messaging apps are spreading misinformation. So in the recent Israeli-Palestinian war, Afir Gendelman, a spokesperson for Netanyahu, posted a YouTube video that purportedly showed rockets being launched from Gaza into Israel. In reality, the video showed rockets launched from Syria in 2018. The spread of myths or disinformation undermines deliberative systems and democratic governance. On the other hand, social media and messaging apps can democratize mass communication. So in the recent attacks, Palestinians and Arabs in East Jerusalem filmed and shared their experiences. And online protesters have changed the discourse, making connections to other social justice movements such as Black Lives Matter. In addition to these democratic problems and potentials, there is hope that new technologies can also be used to improve the quality, the deliberativeness of political speech in invited spaces, and to move things like citizens' assemblies online to reach a broader audience and engage more people. So that's where Participedia's Democracy and Digital Communications Research Cluster comes in. So these are some of the stories that I've just talked about are things that I think will motivate our research agenda, which is still very open and will develop and think through more today. We have a fabulous cluster, a fabulous team so far. In addition to myself, we have Hans, Jesse, Leslie, Amber, Ricardo, Stuart, Robert, Matt, Graham, Anil, Steve, Ming, and my new graduate student my new PhD student at SFU, Megan. We do have a bit of gender imbalance in the cluster. Just over 71% of our members are men. And while we have Ming from China and Ricardo from Brazil, our cluster otherwise strongly overrepresents the global north. So we're going to keep these issues of representation in mind as we grow our membership and hire research assistants. We also have a very diverse range of folks doing different types of research already. So currently our cluster members are studying things like digital performance. Ricardo in particular is studying this. A few of our members, including Ricardo and others, are studying disinformation or misinformation. We have Robert, who's studying online facilitation and deliberation. Leslie's working with leading the Knowledge Equity Lab, which is studying the geopolitics of knowledge production. Anil in particular is studying the impact of new information technology on democracies in the global south, as well as how COVID-19 is spurring the digital transition. We also have Hans, who has an amazing article in APSR on anonymity and identity in online spaces. If you haven't read this piece, you should absolutely read it. My student Megan is studying online forums on climate policy, and I am currently doing new research on algorithmic governance and when algorithms can make just decisions. Other folks like Matt are kind of mapping online discourses. So we have a really great research cluster already studying fabulous topics. The topics of study that I imagine we are going to look in more detail in Participedia are things like I introduced in the stories at the beginning, solutions for addressing misinformation, the role of tech and social movements, and innovations to enable and empower deliberative communication. Although again, we can talk about this more today. Some examples of these are things like the first draft, which uses algorithms to identify fake news. There's been a lot of sort of newspaper articles about the role of social media in mass social movements, but we can always use more quantitative scholarship. And finally, an example, as we just talked about in the last presentation, also with respect to online communication, are things like Michael Neblo's directly representative democracy, which involves linking constituents with their representatives through these kind of online forums. Our research cluster has already, we've already kind of through email talked about some things that we would like to see strengthened or expanded with respect to Participedia's research capacities related to our cluster. But again, if you have new or more ideas, please write them down and we can talk about it in the small groups. So things that came up that were important for members of our cluster in terms of strengthening their own research agendas are things like continuing to build out and strengthen our case data, using Participedia as a data repository and for data aggregation, as well as sharing and linking multilingual data, adding more kinds of qualitative data. There was also a really great idea of using Participedia as a database for tracking social movements and protests, which I think is a great, very interesting idea, as well as collecting and storing data on the outputs of processes and having databases of digital data, such as Facebook ads and things like that. And so yeah, that summarizes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to hearing your ideas and your feedback.
Thank you, Edana, for that overview and a look at what the different folks in the clusters are doing. That gives us a real sense of the tangible work you'll be up to. Bonny is with the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice at McMaster University in Canada. Over to you, Bonny.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have to start by saying that our cluster really hasn't had the time to talk about this. So this is mainly coming out of conversations we had prior to putting in the grant. So they will expand on this later on. So our cluster is going to be focusing on human and political rights. And our work is going to be founded on the view that we believe that rights are key vectors of democracy. The main goal of the cluster will be to map, theorize, document, and explain innovations in human and political rights, particularly those that seek to support democracy and democratic innovation. The cluster is one of 6 clusters in the Participedia Phase 2 project, but we also recognize that there are many themes that we'll be addressing that will overlap with other clusters. So for example, clusters such as democratic representation, democratic accountability, and even the cluster on digital democracy will all have human rights dimensions. We recognize that human rights can be vectors of democracy, and we're interested in the struggles to attain and expand them as vectors of democracy and as democratic innovation in and of themselves. These include studying the innovation in human rights discourses and movements and how they enhance democratic participation. As democratic values and principles are threatened and constrained around the world, human rights have become discursive and deliberative spaces for political organizing and expression. People and organizations are increasingly articulating demands for civic inclusion and the legitimizing language of human rights. So you're seeing a lot of action-oriented participation founded on human rights. At a global level, we see these innovations and the rise of human rights movement and the use of this movement, the way they draw on human rights, from the Me Too movement to the environmental justice movement to the racial justice movement. So we believe that human and political rights offers infrastructure for democratic inclusion and influence. National and international human rights laws and policies provide normative frameworks for many of the innovative practices that have already been documented in the Participedia platform, and we want to study how they work. For example, an increasing number of states are reluctant to honor established international human rights treaties or fulfill their own domestic human rights obligations. And human rights and civil society organizations are increasingly responding to these erosions on human rights norms through innovative grassroots movements and organizing. So for example, the assault on human and political rights is reflected in the rise of reactionary and restrictive populism, xenophobia, and for those of us who do human rights, the growing intolerance of torture in the name of an unending war on terror. It's an example of the assault on human rights. These growing democratic and human rights deficits are not limited to the global south or the developing world. Increasingly, we see that in advanced industrial liberal democracies, there are also challenges to human rights. We're also interested in how local people are responding, using the lexicon of human rights in their struggles for equal status, for inclusion, whether it's women empowerment movements, climate justice movements, and disability rights movements. One of the focus of our work, I hope, will be to look at how groups are using indigenous knowledge to interpret human rights. So in other words, interpreting human rights through indigenous knowledge. A good example of this would be the Ubuntu human rights movements in South Africa. And there are many across the world where local people are vernacularizing the language of human rights in social movement processes. As part of the cluster work, we'll be looking at case methods, researching case methods, documenting on Participedia to determine if they have a positive or negative impacts on human rights. But this raises a major theoretical question. How do you even begin to determine what is a negative or a positive human rights effect? So I imagine that there'll be a lot of theoretical debates about how to address that question. And also the contextual meaning of success or failure, just as we've had in the debates about democratic innovation. One of the ways we hope to address this is to focus on how organizations and movements themselves measure success. What do they consider success? We will be looking at the factors that shape how organizations measure success. Our cluster work will involve a broad range of research tools and methodologies. We have a diverse team. We have social workers, we have a sociologist, we have historians, we have legal scholars, criminologists. So we will draw in all these tools, theory and methods, surveys, data analysis, interviews, and ethnographic research. Apart from developing more human rights cases, we will build representative case sets in areas where crowdsourcing is inadequate, and also select exemplary cases to build out through ethnographic data. A big question that we will be addressing, and I have to thank my coach, Ruda Haas, for raising this question, is how do we identify and account for biases in crowdsourced data? So this is the challenge that Participedia Phase 2 will have to confront, and we plan to engage with this in our cluster. Our research assistants will work collaboratively to integrate literature on democratic innovation, human rights, and social movements in the case studies that we identify to build out. In terms of timeline, we hope that our cluster's timeline will align with the draft project timeline, which includes a discovery phase, a defining phase, a defining and refining phase, a development phase, and a delivery phase for the first 2 years. We are confident that we hope that the work of the Human Rights Cluster will provide useful and interesting insights into how organizations and communities are using human rights law and principles in innovative ways to address democratic deficits. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bonny. That is very inspiring and so very important given the political context of today. Our next presenter is Archon Fung from the Kennedy School at Harvard University in the United States. Archon, over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. So I am in the research cluster on participation across borders, and I wanted to just spend a few minutes laying out that cluster and how the topic of that cluster differs from some of the traditional work that Participedia has done in phase 1, and then lay out some initial directions for research questions. So over the last part of the 20th century and the 21st century, we've seen the growth of a large number of international governance organizations that attempt to address problems that emerge across borders, from public health to trade to international security to human rights violations. And participatory democracy, so that raises the question of whether or not these organizations work in democratic ways. And the main way that they've instantiated the idea of democracy is to give nations representation. The question for this research cluster in phase 2 is whether those problems and that endeavor of solving problems and engaging people across borders can have a participatory cast. And it's very appropriate that this is a phase 2 project for Participedia, because citizen participation, individual participation, most of it, at least most of it that we know about, occurs at the local level. And that was really the bread and butter of Participedia in phase 1, with lots and lots of examples, from participatory budgeting to community planning to watershed governance. And then we see some examples in a national participation with constitutional assemblies, as documented by Ellen Landemore and among other people, national deliberative polls. And the topic of this research cluster for phase 2 is transborder and multinational participation. And what does that look like? And so let me offer a couple of conceptual starting points. A big kind of conceptual question is, what does democratic participation track? And I say democratic participation here intentionally. I think that most of the, at least for now, the instances of cross-border participation that we're going to be examining are much more like democratic participation rather than participatory democracy. So one idea is that participation ought to track problems. When you have issues like immigration and climate change and trade, these are problems that people encounter. And so participation ought to give people voice to address those problems. So that idea is that participation tracks problems. Another idea is that participation might track functional institutions. So as I said earlier, there's been the rise of a lot of international and multinational institutions to deal with these problems. And one question whether it's the EU or the UN or the WTO or trade agreements like NAFTA, or most recently the WTO or the WHO in the wake of the pandemic, is whether these institutions ought to be democratically accountable and how. So another idea is that participation ought to track the rise of institutions, and that what participatory democracy is about right now is democratizing institutions that solve these transboundary problems. So those are two different starting points here. Now, toward a few words about the research agenda. What are the values that cross-border participation and participatory democracy might serve? One such value is knowledge and epistemic quality. We might want to engage people in these cross-border problems to get a better sense of what people want. People who don't usually receive voice and representation in other international or transnational venues. And another kind of hypothetical question is, what would those people agree to if they want different things after they participate and after deliberation? A second function is setting the agenda on issues like immigration and human rights and climate change. I believe that it's the case that some voices receive and some interests and perspectives receive less attention than others, and have less of a role in determining what sorts of issues international audiences and governments decide to tackle and address. So agenda setting is a second important function or value that transborder democratic participation might serve. And then finally, a third value is voice and influence. And this, again, is common to many advocates of participatory democracy, is that we are concerned with equalizing voice and influence. So three values that cross-border participation might advance are knowledge, agenda setting, equal voice and influence. And so a little bit about a research agenda. What are some of the questions that this cluster might ask? And if we begin with those values, all of the questions are about what are the circumstances and designs for cross-border democratic participation that advance those values of better knowledge, fair agenda setting, and equal voice and influence. And so here are some initial questions that we might begin with. There are many, many questions in this domain. Of course, I just wanted to offer a few starting points. First is, who sponsors cross-border participation? In local and within country participation, oftentimes those are invited spaces that are sponsored by governments. In these transnational and cross-border contexts, I think it's much more likely that some of the initial instances will be sponsored by non-governmental organizations and sometimes by intergovernmental organizations. And then maybe, and I think we should be especially attentive to this, social movements. Some of them might be sponsored by transnational social movements. And then I think that the cluster should seek to look for both invited spaces, but especially, less obviously, we should look hard for claimed spaces of cross-border democratic participation in the IDS language. A second kind of question for the research agenda is who participates? And then more normatively, what is the norm of fairness in participation, right? In a community or even nationally, many people have said the gold standard of fairness and participation is demographic representation. Is like if half the country or the locality is women and half is men, then maybe the participatory body should be half men and half women, right? Makes sense. That's the descriptive representation view captured in deliberative polling and other kinds of mini publics. But the norm of fairness, we don't really have those kinds of well worked out norms of fairness in the transnational context. So say it's a transnational border dispute and one country is 10 times larger than the other. Should that mini public should afford the larger country 9 participants for every 1 participant in the smaller country? I don't think so, right? That's not kind of the norm of fairness that we're after. But what is the norm of fairness in cross-boundary participation? That's going to be an important question for us to answer. And then finally, what are the effects of participation if there's transborder participation, democratic participation across borders, but nobody hears what they say or it doesn't have an effect? Doesn't matter that it happened. One kind of effect we might look for is opinion change, either at the mass or elite level in the societies that are involved. And then we might also look at, though I suspect this will be harder to find, empowered participation in which cross-border participation of people trying to solve some problem actually results in empowered policy changes. I hope we see that. I don't know of any instances of that right now that have happened, but I think it's worth looking for. And then all this is to say that I regard this research cluster as embarking on a pretty new frontier of democratic participation. And so Participedia, I believe, is exactly the right approach. The kind of classic Participedia approach is to let's see what's out there and gather a bunch of instances, look for a bunch of instances, try to document them very thoroughly, do that first, and then see what sense we can make out of them. And I think that's very much the stage of investigation where we stand with regard to cross-border democratic participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Archon, for that description of the various realms of participation, and also the challenge of thinking through the sponsorship and the participation and impact. That does the tree fall? Do we hear a sound if the tree falls in the forest and no one is there? Appreciate that image. Our first presentation is from Sanjay Ruparelia, who is with the School of Social Research at Ryerson University in Canada. Sanjay, over to you.
Thanks, Susanna. Thanks to everyone for all your insights over the last 3 days. I'm delighted to coordinate the activities of this new cluster. We haven't had a chance to meet similar to human rights. So this presentation is really just to highlight some of the issues that we might address. And needless to say, it's selective and limited, but I think it's a really exciting and challenging area for us to scope. So the idea of accountability is foundational to modern representative democracy. In simple terms, we might say that accountability refers to relationships of power, asking decision makers to explain and justify their actions and hold them responsible through possible sanctions if they fail to discharge their obligations or misuse their powers. So the concept encompasses many actors, institutions, mechanisms, but scholars debate its definition and scope. Simply put, how far does it extend beyond strictly legal relationships between formal institutional actors to involve wide-ranging social practices? What are the costs of imposing accountability in a democracy in terms of time and effort? Who's accountable to whom in our complex modern democracies with wicked problems that scale to the global level? And I think the last one that's really exciting, particularly for this network, is how are the challenges that are faced in democracy bound up with participation, rights, and deliberation? So the form of accountability we know best is, of course, elections. Voters participate in elections to elect their representatives and hold them accountable subsequently. This vertical accountability is absolutely crucial, as we know today. But we also know that elections are severely inadequate for many reasons. The logics and vagaries of electoral systems, for instance, distort the preferences of voters. This is even the case in proportional representational systems to a lesser extent than first past the post. And on the other hand, we also know just generally that elections are notoriously blunt instruments. Despite Indira Gandhi's statement that there's a collective judgment that must be respected, we don't know whether voters are rewarding or punishing incumbents when they do vote, either because of what's happened in the past or whether they're favoring the promises made by them or their opponents going forward. And we certainly don't know what happens between elections. This gives rise to the second area of accountability that's often studied, horizontal accountability, in which power is separated, checked, and balanced. Executives are responsible to legislatures, upper houses check lower houses of parliament, and presidential systems, as we know, have many different veto points. But we also know, of course, that legislatures may fail to hold executives to account. On the one hand, legislators may be whipped into line by their party chiefs, and on the others, as we've known and seen recently, they may simply neglect their constitutional responsibilities for the sake of remaining in office. So lots of Democrats focus their hopes on the judiciary to protect the constitutional order, the rule of law, fundamental rights. The so-called new constitutional era of the post-1970s saw a rising judicial activism in many democracies with lots of innovations we could discuss. India is a very interesting and compelling case in this regard. But similarly, judicial action also raises hard questions about institutional capacity, the protracted delays that characterize legal processes, where due process is the punishment, the potential bias of courts and judges, and the danger of overreach. Who guards these guardians in the first place, or in the last instance? And for these reasons, our constitutional democracies also include many other channels of accountability, from ombudspersons that address civic complaints, to auditor generals who assess public spending, to commissions of inquiry that investigate some matters of significant concern, whether the handling of a natural disaster, systemic corruption, or even imperial crimes. The last 3 decades in particular have seen the rise of truth commissions of various kinds, from Argentina and South Africa to Canada, no least, to document past wrongs and to determine what actions need to be taken now to amend their destructive legacies. Yet such commissions, as we also know, depending on the parameters of inquiry and the powers of sanction, may not really do justice to the concerns we have. Contemporary political leaders may be unwilling to apologize for past crimes, adequately compensate survivors, or enact reforms that dismantle the structures that allow historic injustices to reproduce to the present, something that we face in Canada in particular. Thus, actors in civil society, we know, play a vital role. Media organizations are key actors, establishing facts necessary to hold public officials and private entities to account. And hence, innovations in freedom of information, the right to know, legal protections are crucial in this regard, particularly for investigative journalists and individual whistleblowers. We also look to advocacy groups and NGOs who play an essential role across a spectrum of issues, from human rights violations and ecological devastation to global poverty. Yet we also have to ask, how accountable are civil society actors themselves, as well as media organizations that often cover what they do? And finally, citizens and communities can demand answers, sanctions, and reforms through direct social action, most vividly in the form of mass protests, which some scholars describe as diagonal accountability. This is particularly the case when our formal accountability processes fail to address systemic deficits, such as police brutality in our times. The power of protests in general connects to a broader realm of what's called social accountability. Many of the members of our team are pioneers in this field, where citizens and communities engage local political officials and public service providers through participatory governance and deliberative forums. The range of innovations in this realm are vast, so let me just mention a few. On the one hand, citizens' charters can specify important norms, entitlements, and grievance redress procedures for citizens to expect from their institutions. Community scorecards can encourage citizens to deliberate, provide feedback to service providers, and identify problems and co-develop solutions. Another set of experiments that's very interesting to study is what I would call popular constitutional imaginaries and legal processes, such as grassroots lawyering, civic litigation, and public hearings to conduct social audits. These have often led to national campaigns to legislate a legal right to information. Whether and how these innovations are successful or not, though, requires further study. The global dimensions of democratic accountability in particular, reforming international regimes to check abuses of power by states, firms, and other non-state actors, I think probably remains the most important and difficult arena of innovation that we need to study. So let me end there.
Wonderful, Sanjay. Thank you so much for that overview of some of the challenges and needs for democratic accountability. I'm looking forward to hearing more about this research as we go forward. Our last presenter for the day is Mark Warren from the Department of Political Science in the University of British Columbia in Canada.
Thanks, Susanna. And like many of the other clusters we haven't yet met, I'm chairing the Innovations in Democratic Representation cluster along with Francoise. Now, I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the things that we might talk about. Representative relationships can expand democracy over time and space. They're vectors of inclusion. They're essential to forming and expressing public wills, and they help us think about our extensive interdependencies and vulnerabilities, human and beyond. This research cluster focuses on democratic innovations in representation. And of course, we're going to be discussing what that might mean, but just as a first rough cut, we'll want to be thinking about forms of representation that increase democracy within elections, expand democracy where it's weak or does not exist. We want to be thinking about representation across borders, across time, including future generations. We want to be thinking about representing non-human beings. Our complex globalizing world is now dense with representative claims and relationships, many of which deepen democracy and others of which do not. So while we need to expand our imaginations as to what counts as representation, we're also going to need to be precise about what and whether representation contributes to democracy. So democratic representation is about making those who are not present in key moments of democracy, inclusion, agenda setting, deliberations, and decisions. Likewise, we need to think generally enough that we can capture innovations, but concretely enough to code new questions into the Participedia platform. Now, fortunately, we have good democratic theory to help. Recent constructivist theories of representation have made it easier to think generically about democratic representation. These theories work off the general model that political representation involves groups of people authorizing representatives, and then these same groups having the capacities or powers to hold representatives accountable. So voting in democratic elections, for example, ideally involves both. A vote both authorizes the representative and holds the representative or party or government to account with respect to their platforms or other kinds of promises. But there are lots of other ways that authorization accountability can occur. For example, advocacy groups can make claims on behalf of group members, and group members can either leave or join, in effect, voting with their feet. This kind of representation can work across borders, helping, for example, to democratize international organizations. We have new representative institutions like deliberative mini-publics, which demographically represent groups of citizens to represent other citizens. Most of us, of course, think about leaving a better future to those who aren't yet born. Many of us try to speak for or represent plants, animals, air, and land. So what are some examples? So here are 5 general classes of innovations and representation of the kinds that we'll want to be documenting. We'll be able to theorize many more as we develop this cluster. First, there are innovations that aim to make elections more democratic. For example, since the mid-1990s, India has sought to increase the representation of women in village councils by reserving 1/3 of council leader positions for women through random selection. And then as Nick and Edana mentioned in another case, Mike Neblo in the US has been organizing a deliberative way to connect members of Congress to their constituents, a process that he simply calls deliberative town halls. Now, second class is representation through civil society organizations and movements. These have grown dramatically since the 1980s, often stepping in where electoral representation is absent or has failed. Black Lives Matter, for example, represents those subject to racist police violence, and in so doing also represents democratic principles of equal protection and equality under the law. Third, new forms of representation are moving across borders and expanding globally beyond the reach of electoral democracy. The Paris Agreement, for example, began to put into place representations of the global climate commons, as well as those most affected by climate change. Excuse me. Fourth, indigenous peoples and their allies are representing land, nature, the environment, and heritage in ways that are often prying open settler colonial institutions, as did the clear-cut logging resistance alliance between the Haida Gwaii and non-indigenous environmental allies in British Columbia. Fifth, there are innovations in representing those who are present, but who can't speak or don't yet exist, such as the natural world or future generations. In 2017, New Zealand granted legal personhood to the Wagunui River in order to extend human protections to the natural environment. The Parliament of Finland has an innovative standing committee for the future. Of course, most of the innovations in democratic representation that we're going to be theorizing and documenting won't fit neatly into our research cluster categories. Direct action against clear-cut logging, for example, involves participation by some to represent non-present others, other people, future generations, and an environment that speaks through human representatives. So our job will be to theorize widely and broadly enough to capture innovations and then ask enough questions so we know what the emerging landscape looks like. We need to mobilize our collective intelligence to make this possible. So to borrow a tagline from the podcast, make me smart. None of us is as smart as all of us. So thank you.
At this time, Bonny, I'd like to pass it over to you. I think you've got a slide or two to talk a bit more about next steps, and then we've got a closing exercise.
Okay, thank you very much, Susanna. I'll take very few minutes to do this. So I want to start by thanking the participants, everyone who stayed with us. I see we still have about 62 people, so that's great. Thank you so much. I want to specifically thank the presenters, yesterday's presenters at our kind of innovative thinking through new ideas session. That was very helpful and inspiring. To our students, research assistants who worked with us as facilitators, thank you very much. You know, Participedia runs on students, so you're an important part of this project. Susanna, our Uber facilitator, thank you. You make it look easy, but I know it's a lot of work behind the scenes. You know, I know this is the product of a series of meetings and refining. So thank you so much. And Pat and Jesse working with you behind the scenes. Thank you so much. I want to urge everyone who's with us that we're keen to have you participate in Participedia. I think Participedia really works with more of us contributing and working together. So please stay tuned for conference notes. We will share this. You know, we want to, like I said before, practice what we study, and so one of the ways we hope to do that is to be collaborative in this co-creation of knowledge journey that we're going on together. We'll also be sharing analysis of insights from the conference proceedings. We have a YouTube page, we have a Facebook page. I'm thinking maybe we should think about a TikTok page now. You never know where the young minds are these days. But we are trying to make communicate knowledge from this project as widely as we possibly can. The edited video presentations, like Susanna just said, will be going up on our YouTube page and perhaps even on our platform. Next slide, please. So how can I participate? So like I said before, we have room for everyone. We really are keen to have everyone join this project at some point in some way. For the core team members who were part of the research grant that's just been supported by the Canadian Research Council, we'll have a meeting in July of all cluster and team chairs just to think through how we go about the process of organizing the phase 2 of the project. That will be sometime in July. One of the reasons why we haven't really done much in that regard is because the grant still hasn't been formally announced by the granting agency. And they're very particular about making these announcements themselves. You know, they don't want us running off and making the announcement. So we'll just have to wait patiently, hopefully sometimes this month when they make the formal announcement, and then we can get the ball rolling and organize the meetings that need to follow. Sometime in August, the entire team will be meeting again. That includes all the collaborators and co-applicants to, again, refine some of the ideas we have about how to proceed. For others who've joined us today and contributed wonderfully and want to be part of this, you can continue to support Participedia by writing case and method entries, by using Participedia as a classroom resource. The goal really is to make Participedia the global classroom for democratic innovations. So I know some of you are already doing that. We urge you to continue to use Participedia and have your students contribute. We urge you to add your name to our network mailing list. So like I said before, we do plan as Participedia grows to get more people who are interested into the core team. We just need a year, the first year of the project, to have core team members refine how we need to proceed with the project. But once we get running, I think there'll be room, and this will be contingent on what chairs want, cluster chairs want to do with their group. Cluster chairs, we have a lot of room to decide whether to bring on new members and the terms under which new core members will be joining the clusters. But everyone remains welcome to attend our larger scale partners conference that happens annually. It might happen biannually in the coming years just to get things running. But if you are on our mailing list, you will get that information and you're welcome to contribute. So just finally, please contact us. The key people to contact are Paul Emiljanovich, who is the project manager for Participedia Phase 2, and our design and tech team lead, Jesse Carson, who does all the wonders with the platform and the presentation. So looking forward to continuing this conversation, looking forward to continuing these connections. And let's work together to take Participedia in the next 5 years to a place where it really becomes the global classroom for democracy. Thank you.
Love it. Thank you so much for this charge of being a global classroom for democracy. And thank you for acknowledging the amazing team of people that contributed to get us here. So I know we're at time, but if you can stick with us for another 5 minutes, what I'd like to do is to give us a chance to close and reflect together. So my question for you is, what is, for you, the most exciting opportunity for Participedia Phase 2? Hopefully you've got somewhere, I just pulled this out of my recycling bin, a piece of paper and a marker. Use images, sketches, words, whatever it is, to write your answer to that question, hopefully on a piece of paper. If you don't have one around, use the chat, that's totally fine, but don't use the chat if you have one around. Push yourself to be into a slightly uncomfortable place and explore this question. Thank you to those who didn't either aren't on camera or don't have it on hand for putting yours in. Jagat shared exchanging learning and encouraging participation. When you hold up your, so the instructions, we're gonna hold it up. When you hold it up, if you wrote words, they are most likely to look backwards to you because your camera is set up to see yourself as you would in the mirror. It's fine, everyone else can read it. And also if you could hold it up and keep it up so that people can scroll through and see what you wrote, and also that we can take some screenshots of it, would be great. Okay, let's see. And if you can stick your face to the side, that'd be even better, because then people can see who wrote it. Yes. Great. Well, another one that just came in was learning from all of us and ability to contribute to democratic governance. This is great. Mukisa, I hope you're capturing these as you go through. Beautiful. Learning about indigenous forms of democracy and representation, inspire wise action, expanding and sharing our practical knowledge. How democracy survives, learning in a time of change, global learning for democratic innovation, hope and inspiration, diversity, wider network, decolonizing democracy, collaborating, learning and unlearning, connections, be a part of a movement to decolonize democracy. Lots of us using that word, how wonderful. Yes, and decolonize our practices too, as we work together over the next few months, right? That by doing this work in a decolonized way, treating each other as humans, slowing things down, rooting ourselves in land, all of these opportunities, turning towards story, equity and inclusion. Beautiful, cross-pollination. Thank you. This has been, for all of us, a very inspiring few days, and more inspiration and work to come as we go forward, as we create this global classroom for learning about what matters for our democracy. Thank you all for your time, your contributions. You'll hear from us coming up. And thank you for all of what you shared in the chat as well, all the resources and energy and connecting. Bonnie, any last words?
Just to say thank you. And maybe we can unmute. So we're allowed to mute now and just say thanks and bye.
Let's do that.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Susanna.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Yes, bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, Pecha.
Bye.
Bye.